Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today for this conversation, The Identity We Weave. I'm super excited. I put out a post and a call to occupational therapy professionals worldwide about 3 weeks ago, saying that we were having this gritty, raw conversation around our identity, around our language, around systems that we work in, and around the future that we can build together. And I have had like the most overwhelming response. We've had over 1,000 OT professionals from around the world say that they're interested in this conversation and are joining us today. So thank you so much for being here. And I'm excited to start the conversation, really. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Rhiannon Crispe. I am the founder of the OT Lifestyle Movement. I have a podcast that I started a few years back called the OT Lifestyle Movement Podcast. I created a film called Finding Me in OT. And my passion really lies in exploring the intersection of occupational therapy, identity, and purpose. And today we have two legendary occupational therapists joining us today who are really powerful voices within the occupational therapy profession. We have Professor Emeritus Elizabeth Townsend and Emeritus Professor Gail Whiteford. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you, Rhiannon.
Thank you.
So Liz is a pioneer in occupational therapy and occupational science, known for her globally influential work in occupation, occupational justice, and human rights. She was one of the founding faculty members at Dalhousie University's School of Occupational Therapy in Canada and has led major collaborations that have shaped how we understand occupational therapy identity today. Liz continues to advocate for critical occupational literacy and the future of occupational therapy and occupational science on a global scale. Gail has been a leading voice in occupational therapy and occupational science for more than 3 decades. She's held senior academic, research, and leadership roles across Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and has delivered keynote addresses in 13 countries, including the prestigious Zemke Lecture in the US. Gail has developed the World Federation of Occupational Therapists Occupational Narratives Project and was honoured with the Order of Australia in 2023. So today we are having a beautiful conversation for the OTs who are craving something deeper. Maybe it's that you have felt this disconnection to the profession. Maybe you have questioned your place in the profession, or maybe you've just wrestled with the language of how to explain our profession. These are a lot of the conversations that I'm seeing come up in my personal DMs, throughout social media, on big Facebook groups, and in a lot of the circles that I'm in. So we're going to be exploring 4 big questions today in a really short amount of time. So we'll try and get as much depth into it as we possibly can within the hour. And it's really going to cut to the core of who we are as OTs. So the first question is going to center around identity. So who we are and how we stay connected to a shared identity across all the disciplines that we work within. The second question and topic that we're going to explore is around the language. So why it can be challenging to explain what it is that we do and how we can explain it with more ease. The third question that we're going to explore is around systems. So there's often this tension that we can feel between the heart and the soul of OT and working within the systems that can often constrain and constrict what we want to do. And we feel like we're shrinking down to work in systems. And then the fourth and final question is going to talk about the future and how we move forward and how we can be big and brave and take up space in the world. So I've called this event The Identity We Weave, and this was really purposeful and intentional because when I think back to our beautiful profession and how it was started, we had occupational therapists sitting by people weaving baskets. And we had this belief that the simple, purposeful, meaningful, everyday occupations can really bring meaning to a person's life. And so, while we're not really weaving baskets today, not many of us anyway, but I'd love to hear from anyone who is still weaving baskets. But we're still weaving in a lot of ways. So we're weaving meaning into the healthcare system. We weave stories into the paperwork. We weave the humanity into the hustle of healthcare. So it's this metaphorical weaving that we're still doing today. And although we're doing this and we feel strong and centered sometimes in who we are, we sometimes feel like we're fraying at the edges. And I've done a lot of reflecting on this recently, and I think maybe we're at this point where we've had a lot of unraveling, and now it's time for the reweaving, the time for coming back to who we are, and again, like stepping boldly and bravely into who it is that we are, and shining that and showing that with the world. So let's begin. The first topic of conversation is around identity. So Gail and Liz, when we look at our beautiful profession, there's such an incredible diversity. We have occupational therapists in schools, in hospitals, in prisons, in corporate spaces, where we can work anywhere with anyone. And I really believe, like, I love the diversity of our profession. I love it. And I also think that it can be a real challenge for us as well in communicating a clear and recognizable identity. And I think this is something that, if we look over the history of our profession, it's something that we have collectively really struggled with at points. And again, this is something that I'm hearing through a lot of conversations that I'm having. So I'd love to open it up with this initial question. What do you see as the central identity of occupational therapy, given how broad, how diverse, and how far-reaching our roles are? And I might kick it off with you, Liz, if that's all right.
Yes, what a lovely introduction, and what a perceptive introduction of the struggle that many people have felt. And I would start by saying I've been connected to this profession for, I don't know if I'll name the number of years, but a long time. And I've struggled with it the whole time. I still struggle with it, but I do have some ideas these days. And like you say, the diversity is just the most magnificent opportunity when you're an occupational therapist. You see a situation, you think, oh, I could do something there. And I've been very lucky. I've had a lot of variety of work as an occupational therapist. And I'd like to put forward something that Gail and I wrote about some years ago, and it was about what do we do, how do we work, and why. Gail will recognize this, and I'm sure she can add to anything I say on it. And we're going to try not to just agree totally with each other, although I love talking with Gail, and we do have a history of writing together and doing various things. But I think what we do helps to put a definition together. I don't think there's a one-line definition, but it can be fairly short if you start with um, the what. And I think what that is a partnership relationship, a collaborative, not hierarchical relationship. And when you and I were talking, when we were practicing, I was saying that I used to do a skit in doing talks showing the hierarchical relationships of professionals who come in and say, here's what you need to do. I know what's best for you. And the occupational therapist, as the collaborative, ideally, and I don't think I always did it, and I bet not all occupational therapists do it, but we want to find out what is important to people as a community, as a family, not just as individuals. So that collaborative piece is the what. And what we're looking to find out in the what is what's the soul of life for the community, our families, or individuals. And we can give some examples shortly because I think because of the diversity, we always have examples of what we've done. I know what I've done in various places, but how to put that together into some kind of core identity. So that would be the what, a collaborative relationship seeking the soul of life. The how, um, it could be on focusing on what people need and want to do. There's always a doing, thinking, reflecting. And it's also working with whole persons in their environment. So it's not enough just to say we're holistic. We're looking to see how people proceed with their lives in a particular situation. I will give an example here because it came up just today, talking with somebody about Parkinson's disease and how in the early days, before it was named as such, people had Parkinson's disease, but they didn't give it a name. But it was always part of the culture of a particular community. And this particular thing I was reading was talking about in New England. The community just assumed that that's what happened when you got older. And so there's a social side, not just social view of disability, but there's a society that determines um, how people can move forward. So there's the how, focusing on what people are wanting to do and how that fits in or will need to be adapted or changing the environment to make sure that people can participate. And then the third thing is the why. And that's always about inclusive participation. So if I'm making a splint back in the day, I wish I had thought about this back then, but I think I would have been saying, well, without this splint, so and so can't participate in the workplace, can't manage to live at home. And there's an injustice if, for the sake of some support to participate, we don't provide the supports for people to do their best with whatever adaptations. And we have a million adaptations. People are very clever in occupational therapy. And so you get this focus on the goal of inclusive participation. So I think I should leave this and see what Gail has to say. And I might just add at the end that we began to talk about occupation because we needed to explain our name. But that's a professional term. It's like psychologists who can talk about all sorts of psychological terms, but they can also turn around and say, well, how do you feel? So we can turn around and use whatever language helps to get at whether people are participating, engaging, breaking barriers, doing what they need to do or not doing, finding themselves stuck. So I think
I,
in terms of the language, we
mm.
can work that out. But I'd like to hear from Gail now.
Yeah, I love that, Liz, as well. And I just want to echo what you've said here. So you've spoken about the collaborative relationship and you said seeking the soul of life. Like I love that. And you spoke about context and the environments where meeting people where they are living, where they are working, where they are playing, where they are doing life. And then you spoke about this inclusive participation. And I think that again, like bringing all that together that comes to the heart of OT. So over to you, Gail. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what comes up for you when we talk about the central identity of occupational therapy.
Sure, thanks, Rhiannon. I just want to start with a couple of acknowledgements first. First of all, for me, I really want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm coming from today, which is the Biripi people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And there's some fantastic young Indigenous leaders coming through in my space here in Port Macquarie. I'd like to acknowledge your work in pulling this together, Rhiannon. It's been an amazing response, and I'm so excited to be here this morning in Australia having this much needed conversation. So good on you and the work that you're doing in creating this amazing network.
Thank you.
Very importantly, I'm delighted to be here with my colleague, my mentor, and my friend, Professor Townsend, who really has been a leading light in so many places, but in my professional career has meant a lot to me. And yes, we've had some full-on arguments and some great discussions over time, but it's all been absolutely so worthwhile. And so for me, professionally invigorating. And I hope that that's reached other people too. I've been thinking a lot about what captures it is that is our identity. And I'm going to come back to your metaphor later of weaving, because I think that we've come back to a place where we are claiming our epistemic right to weave our own identity, because I think other people have been far too involved in creating the form and shape of that weaving. We're now taking it back. So we'll come back to that metaphor. But here's what I've been fine-tuning over the last week, and that's this. Occupational therapists work collaboratively with people, enabling them to be included, connected, engaged, and well through doing the things they need and want to do, and which provide meaning, purpose, dignity, and identity in the communities in which they live. It's a long sentence, but it's, to me, capturing some core things we don't always see in definitions of occupational therapy. There's a lot of the how we do that. I think that comes subsequently. Liz was talking about the how, but I did want to highlight collaboratively right up there. But this centres communities in which people live and dignity and identity, as well as meaning and purpose. I think those are really core things for us. I feel so concerned that people are struggling with occupational therapy and how they're able to do it in the systems and settings that they're in, because I've seen it in different places around the world. It is so powerful. It's so powerful. And I've now had 40 years in occupational therapy, and I still am so passionate about it because I can see what it has done for whole communities of people. And I've been in some pretty interesting and slightly dangerous places, but occupational therapy is so important to the lives of so many people. So it seems to me that if we can win back that sense of, you call it the beautiful profession, I call it a really important and vital profession. Let's get back to that, because it really can and does impact the lives of so many people. We should be, I think, in the driving seat of social policy as well as at a practice level for that reason.
Can you read your capture of occupational therapy again, so we can just
Sure.
really let it land for us?
Okay, I'm just going to explain to people that despite the fact that we had a practice run twice, my Wi-Fi connection locally has let me down. So I'm on my phone. So if the phone wobbles around a bit, that's because I'm hand holding it. Anyway, this is part of the fun of it, right? Being live. Okay, here we go. Occupational therapists work collaboratively with people, enabling them to be included, connected, engaged, and well through doing the things they need and want to do, and which provide meaning, purpose, dignity, and identity in the communities in which they live.
I love that. And I'm also wondering, for the OTs who are listening in, because one of the challenges that we see is when we're out at the pub and someone asks, what do you do? Or that classic elevator pitch, it can be really hard to concisely and articulately say what it is that an occupational does for someone who's never heard what we do. Maybe it is someone that we're working with, or maybe it is just a friend and we're explaining what it is that we do. So how do we still capture the depth? And maybe we can't, and maybe that's something we need to wrestle with. I don't know. But how would you explain occupational therapy to someone who's never heard it before?
Yeah. Look, in my different roles in different places, I've got to connect with media, politicians, et cetera, and if I condense this down, I say, hey, occupational therapists work with people to help them do what they want and need to do in their lives.
Mm-hmm. And
So, and people get that. They go,
do they?
what they want to do. Oh gosh. So if you've had a work-related, accident, you want to get back to work. Okay, I go, yeah. Or if you're a parent and, you've have some issue, you've got to get back to looking after kids. That's the stuff that people, they get it. When you talk about doing, that's the stuff of everyday life, and people get doing in a way that we don't need to problematize occupation. I mean, let's take a lesson from marketing. You adapt the message according to your audience, and doing is powerful.
I think that's really important too. So grounding it in whatever's relevant to the person that we're speaking with. What are your thoughts on that, Liz?
Well, I'm just thinking, of course, I agree um, overall, and the search for a short, marketable phrase is ongoing. But I think we've pointed to two ways to come at it. One is the nice phrase about, enabling people to do what they need and want to do. The other way, I think, is to say, well, as an occupational therapist, I work with people, and I gave the example earlier of uh, creating special adaptive equipment for them to, manage with a damaged hand, to take a very straightforward example. Or I'm working with somebody who is so anxious in their life that they can't organize daily life. And then I would link it to the points that we've both just made about a collaborative approach, focusing on what's important, and enabling them to weave together the kind of life that would be meaningful to them and also practical. And then the part about working within systems, I know you've got a question on that, but I think that's where the example can extend. I always have an example of a woman I worked with who had a spinal cord injury, and she was only about 18, and we ended up going down to City Hall to get accessible sidewalks so that she could get out and participate. And so you can hear these words that we're talking about coming back through of participation, inclusion in society. And if you start with an example, then you can tell them some of the background to it and use some of the words that both Gail and I have been using. There's always some connection between what Gail and I are talking about, but we come at it from different angles.
And I love that because I don't think there's one right way to explain it. And I think we can, and I think maybe that plays into the complexity too. Like we don't have a definition as such, and a lot of people have their own definition or understanding or take on our profession or what it is that we do. And when I think about, I mean, this is a great segue into our language component that we're going to talk about. That the word occupation itself, when we say occupation, the first thing that comes to people's minds who've never heard of occupational therapy before is, oh, job, like occupation, job. Like when you fill out a form, it says, your name, your title, your occupation, and we write our job. And so I think this double meaning can cause a lot of confusion initially from the outset. And then beyond that too, I think I saw in the comments there someone saying about physio as well. that a lot of people that we work with will get us confused as physiotherapists or PTs, even nurses. Like they get us confused because maybe we aren't articulate in explaining what our role is, or maybe it's just, again, this marketing challenge that as a profession, we're not clear or concise or consistent globally with what it is that we do and who it is that we are. So maybe Gail, if you kick off on that one, what as we talk to sort of the struggle of this language that we have with regards to occupation and understanding occupational therapy, how can we move forward in this space? How do we better move forward as a profession?
Oh, let's start by saying language is really, really important. It's crucial because language signifies a lot, and we probably should be even more considered about the language that we use because we're sending messages really clearly by our choice of language. So we need to be really considered about that. I've got a really good example from a project that I was working on with some wonderful occupational therapists in a forensic hospital in Australia, in the Forensic Mental Health Service. And this group were reclaiming occupation in a forensic hospital, which had some real challenges to it, but they were really bold and really brave, and they were doing amazing work. For example, setting up an op shop and a cafe and a horticulture space. So people had more of an opportunity to then transfer through to community, having been in the forensic mental health system. Anyway, one of the young occupational therapists had been writing a report, and they changed their report writing to focus on occupation as the core domain of occupational therapy rather than other generic stuff or activities. They were talking about occupation in their reports. Anyway, in a team meeting, the psychiatrist said to her, "I've really noticed a change in your reports, and they're brilliant. I love it. I get a real sense of what you're doing and the power of it and the impact it's having on the patients. I really, really enjoying your reports." He said, "Just one thing. I don't quite get this word occupation. Do you think you could change that?" And she said, "With all due respect, Dr. Blank, I won't be changing that because occupation is our core domain of concern and it's what's most powerful." She said, "But I'm prepared to put a footnote unpacking our definition of occupation in my reports, if you'd find that helpful."
I just got goosebumps.
And he said, "Oh, okay."
Yeah. Wow.
So, I'd call that standing on your epistemic ground, at the ground of our knowing, our knowledge base, and our legitimate claim to it, and staying firm in it. And it's powerful when you do that. So, yeah, language is really important.
What comes up for you, Liz?
Well, it's a great example that Gail has just given. I have similar kind of examples of explaining occupation, but I might point to having actually given a Zemke lecture on occupational literacy. And it follows on what Gail said about the importance of language. And literacy, if you understand the world of literacy, isn't just about the words you use, but it's how you tell your stories, how you express yourself, what you claim as your knowledge. And the use of the word occupation in English is complicated. So I always say occupational literacy is not necessarily about talking about occupation, although Gail's example does illustrate it. It's about using language that captures that your focus is on what people need and want to do in a particular context environment, and that's a policy environment, a physical environment, and a cultural environment, and so forth. So once again, we're telling our sense of identity using those words: participation, inclusion, engagement and linking what people need and want to do to the context in which they're living. So, but I think if you are interested in literacy, literacy for, numeral literacy is about understanding numbers. In this case, it's about understanding occupation and how to talk about it. I think it's a conversation that we could have about the ways people find helpful. And often it's through stories like the one that Gail has just told us.
Yeah. I love that. And I think too, even in our own work, if we think about our own work, that's how we learn about the person that we're working with, is through narrative, is through storytelling. And I think then to bring that back to us as a reflection of how are we telling our story, the story of occupational therapy, the story of who we are and how we can support people on their journey. And it's interesting because I've seen so many, like over the years since I started the OT lifestyle movement, I've seen so many people post threads on big Facebook groups and community groups saying, oh, we need to change our name. We can't be occupational therapists. No one understands what it is that we do. We need to be activity therapists or recreational therapists or not even a therapist. Yeah. Join in, please.
No. Oh dear.
I know, and I feel so grounded in who we are, like our professional identity as occupational therapists. So, yeah. What? Tell me about the laughs you had there, Gail.
Oh yeah. Oh look, all those are just reducing the wholeness of occupation, the complexity of occupation, and that's what gives us a license to have the scope of practice that we do. So let's not break it down and remove parts of it in order just to work with the naming issue. I mean, I think, and I saw a comment from Brock Cook, g'day to you, Brock, that it is about time use and how people occupy time. I have also used that in explaining it to people. It's like, well, how people occupy their time is through their occupations, and and I usually say, well, that was the original meaning of the term occupation, is how we seized or used time. And occupation as being related to work came very much later in history. But we use the extended understanding of occupation is what I say too. How do people occupy time? What do they do in that time? And what brings them meaning, purpose and structure in how they do that?
I love that too. And I think that's how I explain it as well initially when I think before I move on to what I do as an occupational therapist, I have to give that pre-context around, well, occupation means anything you do that occupies your time. And whoever I'm speaking with, if I'm working with a client, I will say, for a child, it may be this or that, or handwriting or toileting or getting dressed in the morning. And I really contextualize it so it makes sense to them. And then I move into what it is, like the therapy side. I think we need to explain the occupation. I think we need to explain the therapy and what we do and how we can support people.
Sure. I just want to add one thing too, and this is, I think, an area we are working with and can do more with, and I've got a good example, is that one of the things that people do that occupies their time, and it's a really important part of existence, is that they're citizens. This this notion of citizenship. I saw a group in Chile of occupational therapists working with people who've been living with mental illness in the community, pull together their submission from community mental health perspective, having input to their constitution in Chile, which was being rewritten as citizens, not as patients, not as clients, not as consumers, but as citizens who had particular insight into living with a mental illness that they wanted to see reflected in the human rights dimension of the Constitution. How's that for a focus? We're focusing on people as citizens.
Yes. No, I love that. And even as I said client before, I'm like, I caught myself because I don't even actually use the word client. I really say people, but I think sometimes it comes out because people know what I'm talking about when I say client. But yeah, I love that. Yeah. Because that's the thing, right? We can work with anyone who needs support to engage or re-engage in their meaningful life occupations.
Mhm.
Let's,
I might just add
yeah.
that when you look
Well,
at the literature on professions,
Mhm,
there's always the emphasis that a profession develops when there's a particular area of expertise.
mhm,
And so our original work was known as occupational therapy because we worked with occupations to enable meaning and all that sort of thing. And so whether we use that word with um, whether we find a way to explain that word or not, nutritionists are about food and architects are about design and we're about occupation. And there's a kind of requirement for us to think about how we're going to tell people about that in a way
mm,
that they will understand. We were talking earlier about, making your message um, to the audience.
mhm,
So, but
well,
that's,
the biggest
yeah, go ahead.
bonus we have is that our domain is in our name.
Yes, exactly.
Occupational therapist. And so,
That's
for
right.
example, my husband, Harry, who's a lawyer, they're very clear that their domain is the law and they're not
Right.
apologetic about that. So hang on,
No.
why should we be apologetic about the fact that
Right.
our name is actually in our name? That really is, I think, could be such a strength for us if we really claim that and use
Yeah.
the language that supports that.
I have another thread to pull on here before we go into systems. When I was looking into the word occupation, I realized that it doesn't translate into every dialect, into every other country. And so this comes out to me as a bit of a challenge. Like, how do we explain what we do to people who don't have the language for it? So in some countries, it's work therapy or ergotherapy.
Yeah.
There are different ways. So how does this play into this central identity of occupational therapy?
One of the things that is central to this discussion is to empower ourselves,
Mhm.
to find a language to explain what we do in whatever context it is, and to put it forward with confidence so that I don't know what people should say about occupation in the Philippines, but there's some wonderful occupational therapists there, and they are becoming empowered,
Mm,
and they will figure it out. So occupation works in English, but in some other languages, they'll be able to find something that is, like we're saying, each profession has a domain of concern, and you need to be able to say what that is and
mm.
not be apologetic about it.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
it's
Mhm.
interesting. I did some research and had a look at different um, what other modalities and disciplines are called. You know, if we think of Taekwondo or other martial arts and different things that have come from other parts of the world, like we adopt those names and we don't call it something else. Um,
Mhm.
so it made me think whether even occupation could be a word that is just used universally. I don't know. Um,
I would probably take a different view, Rhiannon. I think
mm,
context is everything, including social, cultural, and historical context.
mm,
I spent some time in France with occupational therapists, and they were explaining to me that occupation has a very negative connotation because of the war, and
mm,
they really avoid it for
mm,
those reasons. And I think, we don't have a right to say, well, actually, you have to. I mean, they've found a way. I mean, ergotherapy, and then there's actually more extended descriptions than ergotherapy too. But I think people in the different geopolitical contexts around the world have to find the right frame because language, culture, history all are really combined, right? So they've got to
mm,
find a way, but then to unpack it to other people. But
Mhm.
I think what is really connects people though is this idea of inclusion and
Mhm.
participation.
mhm,
People get those concepts, and when you think of some of the countries that people are working in, there are obvious and real challenges, but also, and I hope we've got time to talk about occupational justice as well as a unifying concept.
That's really interesting. I hadn't heard of that in France. I did know they called it ergotherapy. And this is beautiful because I think it brings up more questions than it does answers for me in a lot of ways. So thank you for bringing that up. We've spoken about identity, we've spoken about language. If we can move on to systems. So in terms of a lot of the occupational therapists out there, what I'm hearing is that we go to uni, we study, we learn about person-centered practice, we learn about therapeutic use of self, we learn about deep listening and engaging in conversations and stories and narratives and meaningful occupation. And then we head out into the real world where we practice, and our work is often driven by KPIs, productivity, standardized outputs, speed, efficiency, go, go, go. And we're feeling like we don't always get the time and the space to really sit with someone, to really connect, to really do that heart-centered work that we signed up for in the first place when we started OT. So I'd love it if we have a conversation around this and see what comes up for you. Liz, do you want to hit it off on this one?
Well, yes, and I want to say to begin with, my heart goes out to occupational therapists who find themselves in systems where they can't do what they wanted to do when they signed on to occupational therapy. I've been there, and it's a struggle. If you're in a medical system, they want things done in a medical way, categorized under medical concepts and so forth. I think our next step, and there are stages of development in professions. I think our next stage needs to be to develop a policy and structural analysis of occupational therapy and where it is we get stuck. And then with that, to become the activists who can make changes in the systems where we work. To line yourselves up with other people who are struggling in the same way, but don't be alone. Don't be alone. Yeah.
Community connection, stronger
Yeah.
together.
Stronger together. And it may not be just occupational therapists. You may find some sympathetic people in, I don't know, social work, but also in medicine or in government. And we need administrative and management skills to work our way forward. We have something extraordinarily important, meaningful occupation. That phrase, I don't know how many times that is the center of what people are saying. That's why I live. I want a meaningful occupation. Whether they are getting old or whether they're just talking about their workplace.
Yep.
Or being home with a bunch of kids.
Yeah.
So I think our next stage, in a sense, is to grow up. And I don't mean that in any negative way, but to grow up and to develop that kind of empowerment to speak for ourselves with allies and to be the activists to speak up. I mean, like people with disabilities have been doing for years and making some headway, but yeah, that's enough for the moment. Gail has
No, I
thoughts
love
on
that. I love that.
No,
Yeah.
busting to jump in here.
I can feel the energy.
I think Liz is absolutely right. We're in another era, and this is going to be our counter-hegemonic era. What do I mean by that?
Yes, tell me.
Hegemony is when we act in ways that keep the status quo running, even if we're doing it unconsciously. Hegemony is when we're part of those systems that reproduce discourses of disadvantage and disempowerment and marginalisation of others. And actually, and a lot of the systems that occupational therapists are in, they end up doing work that does that. Even that they don't think they're doing it, they are. And so let's now be counter-hegemonic. Let's be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So this is an era where we challenge and change and fight back to be self-determining through the language that we use and the way that we're interacting with systems and structures. And I have a really good example here, and I see Rob Pereira is on today. Hi, Rob. This is something from Rob's work that I think is really powerful. So Rob works as an NDIS provider, and he has noted the limitations of the reporting that goes back to the NDIS. So his way of being counter-hegemonic is in his reports. He notes that the language of the NDIS is limiting, focusing on weaknesses and deficits. And he says occupational therapists are not about that. We're about strengths. And he goes on to explain that, drawing on his own core approach, occupational therapists are about capabilities, opportunities, resources, and environments. So every time he sends a report through to NDIS, they're getting that in their face every time. That's an example, and good on Rob for doing that, of being counter-hegemonic and not just accepting
the status quo.
The status quo and all the discourses and language and ideas and values that are in behind those discourses and then enacted through the structures. So it is a bit of this is the revolution. It's not going to be broadcast, it's going to be live, to quote the saying. This is part of that response, counter-hegemonic stance. Let's do it.
Counter-hegemonic stance. I love it. I love it. And I love that idea. Yeah.
Well, and I want to just add something, because Gail has touched on a method of being counter-hegemonic, and that is doing our reports. You have control as a practitioner over what you report, even if they say, oh, these are the 5 categories you have to fill in. I remember in one situation writing these long reports because I gave a whole bunch of stuff about the situation and everything else, and they were astounded because they had never thought about occupational therapy the way I was describing it. And so we often sort of be grungy. Oh, I've got reports to do. Do I really want to have to spend the last of my day having to write all this up? Well, that is where you can make change.
I love that.
Right now, there are 680 occupational therapists in the world. That's a lot. Imagine if everybody took this challenge on.
How many did you say, Gail? Sorry?
680,000 occupational therapists in the world. That's a lot.
That's a lot.
That's an amazing resource. At the moment, our ratio is only 2.5 occupational therapists to 10,000 people, though. So there could be more of us. But I think that suggests that we might work in different ways that are reaching communities and populations, perhaps more than having a focus on individual treatment. This is going to be a contentious idea to people, but I think in terms of reach, influence, and really changing society, I think our reach at a community and population level could also be more powerful and where we focus. But 680,000 colleagues you have out there, everyone.
That's amazing.
Let's do it.
This is the moment where I need to have some comment, because in those situations, populations and so forth, people are so likely to say, "Oh, I'm not working as an occupational therapist. I'm doing policy now."
So change of title.
Change of title, but also our own registrars who sign us up. The requirements for what you have to do to be an occupational therapist. I know in a number of settings, unless you're working with individuals, you're not considered doing occupational therapy, and you're off the register.
Right.
And so there needs to be another mechanism besides the licensing to protect individual patients in a medical system. That's very important. But some other way for us to register who we are and then to keep track of that collective.
It's interesting because my understanding has been that occupational therapists, like, we can and we do work with communities, workplaces, organizations, but you're saying that some of the, like, more from the systemic side, that we're not recognized to work with those places so our license can get revoked because we're
Yes.
not doing the hours of the one-on-one. That blows my mind. See, like, why
Yeah.
is this? Like, if this is what's keeping us stuck, how do we move
Yeah.
forward? How do we create this revolution, Gail? If we
Well,
have
okay, maybe we could start by describing our specializations a little differently, using not medical terminology, but our terminology. So I've said this so many times, and so has Liz, let's have people who are specialists in occupational adaptation, occupational transitions, occupational development, occupational enrichment, which is the other side of addressing occupational deprivation. Let's call them by those names, which means we can work across any sector and any system. And we're not tied to medical nomenclature, and we're not tied to pathology.
I was reflecting on this exact point when I was looking at a national conference and the categories of papers. The categories that you sign up for and that you get organized with, they're, medical categories, maybe it would be on accessibility or something, but we're not using those terms that explain who we are. They're all bits and pieces, technology assistance or something. And so we pick a piece of it and describe it, but we don't link it to our profession. So, I mean, we could. So if I put it in the positive sense, it's a matter of thinking out how we want to do that. And Gail, you remember the year that we did have the World Federation of Occupational Therapists in Sweden, and they used all those terms.
They did.
Yep, they
Yep.
did. And we don't still use them now.
And that shows the power of those other discourses to keep influencing us. But let's go back to let's compare ourselves to law. They keep their domain in their specializations. You're in family law or criminal law or constitutional law. So it's really clear what you're doing. Why do we lose our domain in our specializations? We're calling ourselves, any number of
And
things. Hands therapists, pediatric. I'm not criticizing them. I'm just saying that sending a
it's an
message
important
right
area.
there. That's sending a message right there when you could be a specialist in occupational development.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. I love where this
Occupational
conversation is going.
repair or something, because I don't want to undermine the hand therapists either,
No.
but describing their work in occupational terms and developing categories that we could use widely so that they wouldn't just be in one work setting. They could become the categories used by the World Federation, by the Australian
Of course.
occupational therapy. Yeah.
And think of the power then to work across sectors in justice and community and social welfare, in armed defence forces. I mean, education. There we go. We've liberated ourselves out of,
That's what's needed, is this liberation. That's exactly the key word. And I'm wondering, so you said that the conference in Sweden, they were mentioning these different, what do you call them?
Occupational categories.
Occupational categories.
Specializations.
Specializations. Are they a thing, or
Yes,
are
they're a thing.
They're a thing.
They're
Okay.
a thing. People actually are beginning, there are therapists who are beginning to describe themselves as specialists in occupational adaptation, occupational transition. I think that there is someone, and I don't want to name them because I don't know exactly enough about what they're doing, but that's been employed by our federal government as a specialist in occupational transition for people moving in and out of the Defence Force. Because we know there's a lot of risk factors around that. And look how we're showing our value and our contribution in a role like that, a specialist in occupational transitions. Wow. If I was an employer, I'd go, I need that person. If I was the Defence Force, I'd go, I need that person.
Yeah. So is there a list that we can access that lists these different categories or specializations so we can start using the language?
I have listed them in the Docker lecture. I listed the occupational specializations. And
I will find that paper and I will share it far and wide. Okay. Before we wrap it up, I know we're a little over time. We're running a little bit late. We had some tech issues at the start. But in terms of moving forward, bold advocacy in standing in our truth, in speaking what we mean and who we are, what are your final gems for us as we move forward with the profession of occupational therapy? Who would like to go first? What's coming up for you, Gail?
I'll let Liz go first on this.
Okay, Liz, take it away.
Well, I'll go first, Gail, so you can have the last word. Although that might not work out because I might jump in at the end and say, oh, but I think what we're talking about is reflecting on who we are and using a language of participation and inclusion and collaboration and meaning and so forth to describe our work. And that's the description. But also, I think we're saying we need to empower ourselves to speak up, become our own advocates, find a team that's going to work with us and go forward. Be a powerful profession. I've always had a sense that occupational therapists can do so much. So I'm waiting to see how the next generations will go forward. There you go, Gail.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I probably use the metaphor of us moving from adolescence, where we tried on all sorts of identities. Like, I was trying to be a goth for a while. Can you imagine me as a goth? I did. Black hair, dyed my hair black. Yeah, wore black clothes. Pretty funny. Okay, but I'm not a goth at heart. So, and occupational therapy has come out of an adolescence where we tried to be all sorts of other things and explain ourselves in other ways, and really tortured our identity. No, we're adults now. We can stand on our own ground, our own identity firmly, and interact with the world, with political sectors and systems as adults standing in our own 2 feet in our own knowledge domain, and assert our identity, reweave the tapestry that we want in the shape and form and with the elements that we choose and know are important, and take that forward and use connections and networks like what you've created, Rhiannon. No one's alone here. And there's 680,000 of the rest of you out there. Let's use that number. We are stronger together.
I love that.
I would like to.
You're jumping in, Liz.
Yes, of course, of course. I mean, what Gail has said is absolutely right. But she did a land acknowledgement to begin with, and I think if I have the chance to do a land acknowledgement, I am in Mi'kmaq territory in Canada, unceded, and what I draw from that is what Gail's talking about, is that the Indigenous people of Canada have begun to speak for themselves, to tell us who are the settlers, who they are, what kind of a life they want to live. And that's what I think we can do in occupational therapy.
Amazing. Thank you.
We can learn from them. Yeah, how they've gone forward. Just like I've learned from Gail, many of our adventures have been very wonderful.
And that's it. I think it's a big adventure. It's an adventure for us all. And I feel like the current occupational therapists are standing on the OTs who have walked the path before us, and we're just leading this legacy. What do we want to leave behind? And I think each one of us has this special contribution, and we're shaping the profession as we go, as we're working, as we're studying, as we're learning, as we're growing. So it's been absolutely amazing. As I said in the middle, I think it has brought up more questions for me to dive into, to look into. I'm looking forward to looking more into the occupational literacy and the specializations and how we can really show up in bold advocacy for who we are, because the problem essentially isn't that OTs don't know who they are. We know who we are. The challenge is in sharing that, I think, with the world in a way that they understand it, and in a way that we can ensure that we continue to get referrals, that people know when to call us when they need support in their life. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone who has joined us. It has been an
Thank you,
incredible
everyone who has
turnout.
joined us.
Yes,
I know.
you are not alone, everyone. You are not alone.
You are not
No,
alone. And we are
no.
here and we are creating conversations. And the conversation's the beginning, right? The conversation is where we plant the seed. And it's from here like that we start to bloom and grow and think of different ways of moving forward and reimagining what's possible. So
Mhm.
from here, it's about living it, it's about embodying it, it's about taking the knowledge and using it. It's not just turning it off and going back to your workplace and doing
Mhm.
the status quo, right? It's about how do we really embody everything that we're integrating, and really showing up as that OT. So for every OT who's out there, I just want to say, speak up, take up
Mhm.
space, because when the systems feel heavy and when the language feels really clumsy, and sometimes you wonder if it all really matters, it does.
It
And you
does.
matter, and keep weaving one
Mhm.
occupation at a time. So thank you so much. And if anyone wants to listen to more conversations, I have the podcast, which is the OT Lifestyle Movement podcast, where I've spoken both with Liz and Gail on there. So we have separate conversations about different things over on the podcast. We have the film, and anything else that I put out is really accessible. So just head over to the website, otlifestylemovement.com. Amazing. Thank you so
And
much.
thank you to you for putting the conversations together.
No, no, it's my
That's what
pleasure. I
we
love
need.
it. I
Yeah.
live for it. It really fuels my inner fire. Like,
Great.
yeah, no, it's so good. I love it. So I love the profession. I love the people in the profession. And yeah, it's been an amazing journey for me too. So thanks.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone.
Thank you,
Have an
everyone.
amazing day. Bye-bye.
Bye.